Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending our C.I.A. Services seminar series. Tonight's seminar is Practical Deed Restriction Management, one of our most popular of our whole series. As you know, we've been doing our seminar series for approximately 14 years now. We've had a very large number of people who've attended, and thank you so much for attending this evening. All of these seminars are being recorded, and you'll be able to see them again if you choose to, or encourage your other volunteers and leaders in the community to watch them afterwards. They're on our YouTube channel. There's some information at the end which will show you how you can get there. As always, I have other folks here in the studio helping out. I'd like them to come on up now. And so we have Laura Tate directly next to me, one of our most experienced managers with the company. She's a vice president out of our North office. Also is Kim Moore, vice president out of our Southwest office. They'll both be helping out with questions, so if you have any questions at all during the presentation, just type them into the chat box. They'll ask the questions, and that way everyone can have a benefit of the answers that we receive. So thank you very much. As I mentioned, this is one of our most popular seminars because it deals with something that is difficult for volunteers to deal with on their own. It's not black and white as collections are. Someone either owes money or doesn't owe money, whereas in deed restrictions, there's a lot of emotion involved with it. We're dealing with subjective opinions. We're dealing with making decisions that are very close to a person. And so that's why deed restriction management is more tricky than other parts of the business. This is the agenda for what we'll be talking about tonight. We're going to go over why we do deed restriction management in the first place. What's our basis for authority? Why do we get to tell people that they need to mow their yard or remove a car, inoperable vehicle from their driveway? We'll talk about not only your dedicatory instruments, but we'll talk about a little bit the Texas Property Code, because that greatly impacts what we can do as associations. So we'll touch on that a little bit. In some of the other seminars, we've gone into the basis of authority in the Texas Property Code in much more detail. Tonight it's going to be a little bit quicker. We'll then start talking about the management process, how we go about detecting and following up on deed restriction violations or architectural violations. We'll then want to look at how effective we are, and that's where we'll talk about violation statistics. There's a lot of good information in there. We'll briefly look at a few sample letters and sample reports that board members receive. And the whole last half of the presentation is all about handling the tough problems. And we've identified 8 specific, very difficult problems that your association may face. Some of them you definitely face, others, if you haven't yet, it may be in your future. And so we're going to talk a lot about handling the tough problems and not so much about the easy problems, but we'll deal with everything. So that's the agenda for this evening. Let's go ahead and get started. So why do we want to enforce deed restrictions? What are the objectives that we're trying to accomplish? Well, as everything, you can always point to your governing documents, your dedicatory instruments as they're called under state law. In your governing documents, right in the preamble of your CC&Rs, CC&Rs are your declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, sometimes referred to as deed restrictions, protective covenants, many names for that. But right in the preamble of your CC&Rs is a statement made by the declarant or the developer of the community that indicates why we have these documents in the first place. And a typical one, as shown here on the slide, says the declarant, or the developer, desires to adopt a uniform plan of development for protecting the value and desirability of the land for the benefit of each owner. That's the whole purpose of this. And every board member can quote, why do we have deed restrictions? To protect property values. That's not just what someone is saying, that is what is written into the governing documents. And so if you're able to achieve that, then you'll develop a good reputation for the community that will enhance the desirability. And I've listed here some communities in the greater Houston area. I'll also mention some in the San Antonio area. But for example, River Oaks, West University, the Heights, Montrose, and Sharpstown, those were all built around the same time. They're all in the inner area of greater Houston, all certainly within Beltway 8, but in the core portions of Houston. Each one of those, for anyone who's lived in Houston, has a vision for what those communities are like. The deed restrictions and how they're enforced affect how that community ages. Brand new communities are relatively simple, but as a community ages over time, how the restrictions are enforced and managed will impact those communities. So here, if we're talking about the San Antonio area, you can talk about the same thing, whether it be a Castle Hills, Alamo Heights, Terrell Hills, some of the older communities, or moving to the newer ones of Stone Oak, the Alamo Ranch. All of those are attempting to create an image of themselves and to protect that reputation over time. If you have a community as opposed to just a subdivision, a community where people are proud of where they live, then that's going to create a positive attitude, an attitude where they will tell someone else, sure, you ought to be looking in this community to buy a home. That's going to protect property values. That is going to impact the desirability of the neighborhood. And then there's even an impact on crime. And I'm going to show you in a minute something that's been around for many, many years, a theory called the broken window syndrome. So we'll touch on that in just a moment. But again, property values is one of the main things that we talk about. Are we just talking about it, or is there some evidence that deed restrictions can impact that? Well, what we have here is the only data that I've ever seen in Texas that actually deals with property values. It deals with the impact of associations. So let's look at this table right here. There's quite a bit of information on here, but back in the mid-1980s, the Houston area and the state as a whole and the nation as a whole was really hard hit by the recession that occurred in the mid-80s, and it particularly impacted Texas because of the downturn in the oil business. There were a lot of foreclosures in the mid-80s. We had communities with a very large percentage of their homes potentially in foreclosure. And so after the 80s, the University of Houston, their Center for Public Policy, did a study. And what they did, they wanted to find out after the fact, when they had all the data of before the recession, during the recession, and after the recession, what the impact was specifically for homeowners associations. And what they included in their study, they wanted to look at the worst case scenarios. In other words, the communities that were most stressed by this economic downturn. So they were looking at communities with high foreclosure rates. So let's keep that in mind right now, that this set of tables deals with the highly stressed communities. We're going to start by looking over on the left-hand side. And what we have here is this table right here shows us home values during the tough times. And at the time, Harris County, in general, the average home sales price was $73,000. And then they looked at what they felt were effective homeowners associations during this period and ineffective. What was an effective homeowners association? One, it was an association which existed at the time. It was an association that had a board of directors. It was an association which attempted to do deed restriction enforcement and do any mitigation they could of the difficulties that were happening. An ineffective association is the opposite. Remember, these are high foreclosure communities, so they were a little bit less on average home price than the average of all of Harris County. So in an effective association, the average home price was about $65,000, and in an ineffective association, the price was about $47,000. Now let's look at the bottom line here, and this looks at the price decline. So this is from the end of '82, which is right before things really started hitting, to the end of '86 when things bottomed out. And you can see in Harris County, the prices on average dropped by 22%, gigantic decline. If there was an effective association, again, these are the hardest hit communities, it dropped by 28%. But where there wasn't an effective operating association, the prices dropped by 46%. So during tough times, if you're not doing things to enforce the restrictions and maintain the neighborhood, this study showed that it is going to affect property values significantly in the values, especially in the ineffective associations. Let's look at the other side of it. So things bottomed out in '86. Things started coming back up. And so on the right-hand side, you'll see price recovery. In other words, before the recession and the hard times, the prices were, as we showed in the prior table, $73,000 on average in Harris County. And then by 10 years later, the whole area had recovered. So in Harris County, the average price from 82 to 92 increased by 37%, or 130% of the price. In an effective association, yep, with high foreclosures, went up by 123%. But in an ineffective association, it only went up to 90% of what it was in 1982. In other words, it never recovered. After 10 years, when the rest of the county had recovered, the ones with an ineffective association had entered a spiral downward and were not able to easily recover. And you can drive through those neighborhoods today that were in this study, and you'll see that those neighborhoods have not kept up and continue to be depressed relative to other communities. So this is a real example of protecting property values and the impact of deed restrictions and associations. I had talked about crime, and I'm not going to read through all of this. Please do. It's very interesting. But the broken window syndrome was something that was put together in a study of crime and the impact of, again, broken windows. And the second paragraph pretty much describes what the study was. It says, if a window in a building is broken and left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken. And that is because one unrepaired window is a signal that no one cares. So breaking more windows has little cost to society. Unintended property becomes fair game for people out of fun or plunder. And you can think about that in terms of inner cities, but it really applies anywhere. If disorder goes unchecked, then you have a vicious cycle. It goes on and talks about those things. At the very end, it says that a study analyzing crime indicated that the level of disorder of a neighborhood is much more of a factor than things like income level, resident turnover, or racial makeup. So that's the broken window syndrome. It applies to crime, but it has a parallel in deed restrictions. The parallel being if if a community doesn't allow, for example, boats and trailers in the front yard, if one boat and trailer is in a front yard and it's allowed to remain, soon you'll have more boats and trailers. And so the same theory applies in associations, that we need to be attentive to those things. We can't allow that downward spiral to occur and become the norm for the neighborhood. Well, now let's go ahead and move on to why an association and why the board of directors can ask its residents to do certain things. So let's start with the documents that you have in your community. Under state law, these are referred to as dedicatory instruments. We generally refer to them as your governing documents. Either term is perfectly fine. There are a number of documents which are created. Two that govern the operation of the association are the Articles of Incorporation and the bylaws. The articles currently for new communities are called the Certificate of Formation. So the Certificate of Formation creates the association. The bylaws are the standard operating procedures for that corporation, for that association. And so the bylaws deal with things like the composition of the board of directors, the officers, how they get elected, rulemaking authority, and a variety of things like that are all in the bylaws. Now we move on to the things that govern the use of the land. The main thing are the deed restrictions, or the CC&Rs. Those documents deal with the owner's rights, responsibilities, and obligations, as well as the association's authority over the land and how the land is used in the community. We have the plat. The plat is what divides up every square inch of the community by the developer. Every square inch of the community is divided into lots, reserves, public areas such as streets or private streets in a gated community. The plat is actually the very first document of everything you see on the slide that ever gets filed. It's prepared, the county commissioners, the city, the engineering departments of either one all have to sign off on that before anything else can be done by the developer. So it's actually the first document that's filed. In addition, associations can create architectural and deed restriction guidelines, as well as many other types of guidelines. And those are internal interpretations of generally the CC&Rs, but sometimes the CC&Rs and what might be on the plat. And so our CC&Rs, if you've read them, and you all have, they're very difficult to read. There's a lot of vagueness in there, and a lot of that is intentional. With some vagueness, sometimes we have flexibility to deal with situations that maybe were not envisioned at the time the original documents were prepared. So with guidelines, for example, a board of directors can say, sure, the deed restrictions indicate that you can have a storage building of up to 120 square feet, and that's all it might say. But you put together architectural guidelines that say, yep, it can be up to 120 square feet. You cannot place it on a utility easement. The paint color must match your home. It must be kept in good repair. And so there's a number of things that you can clarify in guidelines to help owners understand what the expectations are. Guidelines are wonderful. We're going to deal with a few of them this evening, but guidelines allow, one, the homeowner to understand the expectations for the community without having to guess by reading the deed restrictions. It also allows the board of directors or the architectural control committee to uniformly make decisions off into the future. As personnels change, as board members or ACC members change, you don't want the rules that owners have to live with changing with the change in personnel. So if we have written documents, written guidelines, it helps ensure uniformity over time. So guidelines are a wonderful tool for all associations. It helps everyone out. And then finally, we have policies, procedures, rules, and regulations, which also are adopted by the board, which ensure uniform operation of the association. Guidelines are more on the land, whereas policies, procedures, rules, and regulations are generally how things operate. So you have pool rules, you have parking regulations, you have collection procedures, you have deed restriction enforcement policies. So all of those are great things to help ensure uniform, consistent, fair operation of the association. Those are all the documents that are unique to your community. Every community has their own. They may look like other communities, but they are yours and yours alone. You, the board of directors, and all of the owners, depending on the document, have the right to and the ability to adopt and or amend those documents. Once we move beyond your governing documents, your dedicatory instruments, there are many other things which affect what a homeowners association can do. So there are local, state, and federal laws or ordinances that either give an association additional power, additional authority. They may restrict, curtail, enhance an association's authority in certain areas, or sometimes they may be totally unrelated to what an association can do, but are an ally for an association. So let me give you some examples. Starting with, actually we're going to do it from the bottom up. Let's start with federal laws. So on federal laws, for example, we have the Telecommunications Act, which came out in the early 1990s. And the Telecommunications Act deals with a person's right to receive over-the-air signals. Sounds interesting. Originally, it was for television and radio signals. The rules have since been expanded to include data over the air. So, for example, internet signals and a variety of things like that. Back in the 1970s, when satellite dishes first started coming out, those of you who remember, satellite dishes were gigantic. They were 12 feet, 10 feet, 8 feet in diameter, gigantic. And so it was very common for developers to write into the deed restrictions that satellite dishes are not allowed, because they didn't want these 12-foot dishes sticking up over 6-foot fences all over the place. Technology changed, dishes shrunk. Now they're generally about 18 inches in diameter. When this federal law was passed, it said that basically any dish less than 1 meter, 39 inches, in diameter cannot be prohibited from an association or any other authority. So a city, county, or any other authority cannot prevent a citizen from receiving an over-the-air signal. So that's a federal law that restricts what an association can do. We won't go into the details of any of these laws. When we move to state laws, we have two things that impact community associations. The Texas Property Code, the 200 series chapters, deal with property owners associations. We then have the Chapter 82 section of the Property Code, which is referred to as the Uniform Condominium Act. So that deals with condominiums. And in those laws, we have those chapters, we have things that both clarify and expand the rights and authorities of associations, as well as things that curtail the ability of associations to deal with certain items. So, for example, in some of the other seminars, we talk about, for example, Chapter 204, Chapter 204 is a highly bracketed code. We'll talk about bracketing in just a moment, which applies to Harris County, Galveston County, and Montgomery County only. But it was put together to really help associations who had old and incomplete documents. So it added clarification to an association's authorities. Great law, but it was very tightly bracketed so that it could even pass through the state legislature. Then we have the 209 series, Chapter 209 series of laws, which put many restrictions on associations. When they first came out, we were all concerned in the industry about how difficult they were. In hindsight, we all got past our concerns. It has added a whole level of fairness for homeowners in those sets of laws. So it deals with things that we're all comfortable with now, that an owner absolutely has a right to a hearing in front of the board. There are restrictions on foreclosures, so we can't have, whether it be attorneys or associations or self-managed associations, going off and doing something as serious as a foreclosure without the owner having all the rights that are now in the law. When we move to local, there are so many things, especially if you're within a city that has the resources, or within a city which has resources versus within a county which doesn't necessarily have as many resources. In the local area ordinances. So for example, if we're talking about health and safety, that's where animal control comes in. What can an association do under your own CC&Rs? Certainly it indicates that dogs aren't supposed to be running loose. But does it have anything in there specifically about barking? Maybe. But what can we do about barking? Or what can we do about a running loose dog? We can send a letter to the owner if we know who owns that dog. If we have a green swimming pool, I'm going to show you some pictures in a little bit. What can we do? We can try to contact the owner who maybe has already walked out of the house pre-foreclosure, but a city or a county health department can come in very quickly and take care of problems like that. So local government ordinances are very helpful to associations. Before I go on to the next section, I think I've got a question here that came in from what state?
Texas.
From Texas. Wonderful.
Ralph, we have a question coming in from Penny Bateman. Penny would like to know, could you clarify a little bit more the difference between guidelines and that of policies and procedures?
Sure. The difference between guidelines, policies and procedures, rules and regulations. I wouldn't at all get caught up on the words themselves. Each one kind of defines what it actually is, but the reality is that guidelines are there to expand on what is written in the CC&Rs. So they could be architectural type issues, they could be use issues, they could be things that state law says we need to create guidelines for. Whereas policies and procedures deal more with how we operate the association. So we have a collections policy, we have a deed restriction enforcement policy or procedure, rules on who gets to go to the pool, that you can't run on the deck in horseplay. So I wouldn't get too concerned about the words. All of them, however, are items that are legally enforceable for reasons I won't go into, but they're as enforceable as the underlying documents which give us the right to create them. So thank you very much. Good question. Let's go ahead and look at just a little bit more on the Texas Property Code. As I already indicated, some of the things that are in there. We have chapters 201 through 15, which have been amended almost every session. I won't go into 2017, but there were several amendments to the property code that were proposed for 2017. And as of today, unless my helpers over here tell me, as of today, not one of them has yet been signed by the governor's office. And so we still have, how long in the session? 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks left in the session. And we'll see if anything does get passed in this particular session. There were a couple good laws in this session. There were several that were of great concern. I'll just mention one of them that is not going to pass, hopefully, just because it's outrageous. And that is, there was a law that being proposed that any homeowner had an absolute right to speak for 30 minutes at every single board meeting. And so if you have 3 or 4 homeowners who want to be abusive to the board of directors, they come to every meeting and they filibuster for 30 minutes and no work gets done. So some of the laws that are introduced sometimes are quite problematic. When I talked about bracketing, in all the chapters of the property code, not all apply everywhere. So if you are interested in reading the property code, there's a couple links shown here on the screen. The easiest thing is just go to our website, the library page, and then we have a quick link to each one of the chapters. But not all apply. So if you look here, for example, at this particular table, you'll see that in the Houston area, some apply in certain places, some apply in others. Chapters 202, 207, and 209 are statewide, so they really do apply everywhere. The rest, for example, you see chapters 213 and 215, they don't apply anywhere in the Houston area. Those are very highly bracketed to essentially individual communities in other parts of the state. This is the same version for the San Antonio area. Your manager knows his stuff, but again, if you want to track down this bracketing, this table will help you out. The law itself describes what it's bracketed to, but it doesn't say, for example, 204 applies only to Harris County, Galveston County, and Montgomery County. It uses really strange wording that you need a calculator and Google basically to try to figure out what it applies to. I want to show you some pictures. Every community manager, every management company could write a book. There's no doubt about it. And so I want to show you these pictures right here that show you a little bit about what we all face. So let's start in the upper left-hand corner. What you're going to see here is you have a fence that is in disrepair. Fine. But because it's in disrepair, you can look through the fence. What you're going to see is there is a junk car in this person's backyard. It's not operable, it's just a junk car. You'll also see, if you look real close, you'll be able to see that the grass is up to the front bumper, which indicates that, maybe there's 3 issues here. If you would fix the fence, we'd only know about, well, there wouldn't be any issues that we'd know about. Moving to the right-hand side, this is one of my favorite painting violations. And you'll notice right in the center of this photograph right here, there's this white section. That's not a painted white section. The paint has cleanly peeled off. It just fell off the siding, all the way from the top, all the way to the bottom. And it's hard to see, but if you look over here on the left side of the side of that house, what looks like is hanging down there like a brown sheet, that is another piece of paint which has just peeled off and hasn't fallen to the ground yet. It's one of my favorite painting pictures. If we look over on this picture right here at the bottom left, what we see is excessive mildew. And all Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts know that's the north side of the house. And it's a picture in Houston because Houston has very high humidity. And so the north side of houses in Houston, without care, often look like this. until we send them a letter and help them out. We always have maintenance type issues. This one is a garage door which has been damaged significantly. It's now off the track. I don't know, but my guess is there is a new driver in that house. Maybe not. But in any case, a vehicle ran into that door. Let's look at the next page. Now we're looking at a bunch of vehicles, trailers, tractors, and things like that. Upper left-hand corner. This is a boat. You can see all the green mildew on it. It's been there for a while. That grass isn't very long, but you can't see the tires on the trailer. It actually is sitting on a trailer. You can't see the tires because the tires are flat. This is another one where, how in the world did that boat get back there? Well, the owner, if you look right over here on the right side, you'll see a part of a fence. The owner took down the fence in order to drag the boat back there. If the owner had just put their fence back up, maybe we wouldn't know about it, other than the fact that they probably didn't take the drain out of the bottom of the boat. It's probably filled with water, and all the neighbors are complaining about the mosquitoes that are being breeded in the boat. Over on the right-hand side, we have a owner who happens to be a long-haul trucker, and so when he comes home, he parks his big tractor in the driveway. And when do long-haul truckers leave their home in the morning? 3 or 4 in the morning. They warm up their tractor, wake up all the neighbors, and annoy the neighbors. Over here we have a pop-up trailer. This was the example I talked about earlier with the broken window syndrome. If this person brings his trailer home, leaves it in the driveway, then we have a situation where the neighbors are going to be seeing this. And the neighbors are going to say, why am I paying $75 a month for storage when my other neighbors are storing for free? The last one on this page, then I'm going to take some questions before I go to the next couple pages. This one right here, it's a boat in the street. You might think, yep, that's bad. It's actually worse than you think. If you look right here, you see these little dots in the street. That's showing you the center line of the street. There's a side street. This is a 90-degree turn in the street. If you're going towards the boat and you want to go around the corner, you need to pull out into the other lane. Likewise, if someone's coming here, the opposite direction, this boat is going to block the view. So not only is this unsightly, this is a major safety issue in this particular case. Well, I think we have another question from Texas.
Yes, Texas is just full of questions this evening.
Yay.
Ralph, I have a question coming in from Ravi Aurora out at River Park on the Brazos in Sugar Land, Texas. Ravi would like to know, when do you think is the time to stop the follow-up process, realizing that the association may be wasting time and money on deed restriction violation, assuming that the homeowner is not going to respond at all because the legal process is very expensive?
That is a great question, Ravi. And Ravi is a treasurer, isn't he, of River Park. And so appropriately, someone needs to look at the money side of this. And what's very, very important, and we're going to get to this when we talk about the process, what's very important is that the association never bluffs. In other words, if you have no intention of following up on something, don't start sending letters. Because all you've done at that point is you have proven to that homeowner, and maybe others, but specifically that homeowner, that these letters don't matter. Just don't cooperate and you're off the hook. And so it's very important in the process for everyone to be on the same page, the board of directors be on the same page, and with the management company to ensure that we're only sending letters on things that we need to. Another side of that is certain things only have one end result. In other words, the only direction we can go to resolve this is by going to the attorney, potentially filing a lawsuit. An example of that would be painting your house. If someone's house needs to be painted and they absolutely refuse, we may end up going to court and all the costs associated with it. Whereas on something different, such as someone's not mowing their yard, we've got alternatives that are not as expensive. And so I'm not saying don't go after the little things like trash cans in view and mowing. I'm saying that we need to tailor our solution to what our options are. So great question, and it's going to lead into some of the management process things we'll be talking about. So thank you, Ravi. Let's look at some other photos here. And so now we're going to get into a little bit of landscaping. In the upper left-hand corner, you see some nice bushes. You'll notice in front of those bushes, this is actually the street. That's the curb. Here's the street. And these bushes are out over the street. When they were installed by the homeowner many, many years ago, I'm sure they were 1 gallon, 5 gallon, tiny little shrubs, but they have gotten larger. They went ahead and also planted it looks like a crepe myrtle, but I'm not sure what it is that's between the two. Believe it or not, there is a house behind there. Here's the driveway. You can barely see the car. And these are right in the center of that green setback. So just like they're sticking over the street, over here you can see the sidewalk. They're equally covering up the sidewalk so that anyone trying to go through there has to either go on their grass or walk out in the street. The one on the right-hand side is also one of my favorites. This particular owner loves palm trees. You can't quite tell from the photo the way it's reduced like this, but there are actually 4 rows of palms. There's a total of, I believe the number I can see in the photo is 39 palms that they have planted in their front yard. This was shortly after planting, and this was about a dozen years ago. So you can imagine what this yard would have looked like if the association didn't intervene and was not successful in having this nursery moved out of public view, which essentially what it was. So that was a very interesting one. Bottom left, unfortunately, we see once in a while that's a vacant house that's unmaintained. Sometimes it's an occupied house which is unmaintained, but certainly when there are foreclosures, we see this at some point. And then over on the right-hand side, there's just no way to adequately show this unless we made it a very large photograph. But all those nice colors that you see in there, those are decorative ornamentation. It's not a holiday, it's not an Easter decoration. This is permanent decoration of that particular house. And there are hundreds and hundreds in the front yard, right all the way to the street, and on both sides of the side yard. I have no idea what the backyard looks like. Potentially there's nothing back there because they want everyone to enjoy their taste as opposed to just their family. The last couple, the top 2 are green swimming pools. The one in the upper left-hand corner was actually just taken on Friday of a swimming pool. You can see the grass that's growing up through the deck. You can imagine the grass behind the pool. This is a mosquito breeding ground. It happens to be in the San Antonio area. And it's something that the circumstances for that particular ownership has resulted in no one going to the property because of their own legal reasons. And so the association is left to deal with that. On the right-hand side is another very interesting swimming pool over here. This one you'll see is half empty. It's also green. The interesting thing about this particular pool, and again there's a story associated with all of these, with this particular pool is this owner decided they had the expertise to build their own pool. And so this was not built by a contractor, it was half built by the owner. And you can't see it in this photo, but over to the right in their backyard is a big pile of dirt, equal to the size of this pool, because they dug out the pool, just put the dirt in their backyard, behind their house. My question is, so how did they plan to get that out? They've put a hole in the ground over here. There's no room on the other side of the house. Homes all around them. How are they going to get that dirt pile out? I don't know. But in any case, this was a good example of where the city of Houston, being within city limits, was able to get this resolved, at least relative to the pool, by using city resources instead of association resources. Bottom left-hand corner, this was right when we started using digital photographs, so it was literally 20 years ago. And this particular owner, we sent a letter saying your back fence is deteriorated, and that owner called me. I took this particular phone call and said there is nothing at all wrong with my back fence. He swore up and down, and we happen to have digital photos. And so when I described to him, and you can barely see it, when I described the rusted out barbecue pit lying on its side in his backyard, at that point he admitted that, maybe there's a little hole in the fence. And so having photographs certainly helps. The final one I want to point out is over here on the right-hand side. This particular one is also a homeowner improvement where the homeowner decided that they wanted to put a deck on the back of their house. This house over on the left-hand side has a setback garage on the other side of the vehicle that you see here. So when they were out there doing it, they decided, let's go ahead and connect to the garage. And by the way, let's expand it over the driveway. So they did all of this without any review or approval. We ended up eventually going to court on this one and got a very large judgment against the owner. And this extension no longer exists. But what's particularly disturbing about this one, if you notice over here on the right-hand side and you see the wood fence right here, the wood fence starts about this location. That's the property line. This improvement is exactly 8 inches from the property line, which first of all violates any setbacks certainly that are there. This particular community has 5-foot setbacks between homes and property lines. And so the home on the right-hand side is 5 feet from this fence or 5 feet 8 inches from this structure. In this particular home, the master bedroom is on that side of the house. So you have a balcony out here that is towering over the master bedroom 5 foot 8 inches away. Clearly, not something that the neighbor was very happy about, and why it was necessary to proceed against them. So, we've seen the challenges that you're all familiar with. You've seen different things in your own communities. These are some of our Hall of Fame type pictures. Hall of Shame, I don't know what you want to call it. We have many other stories, but that's enough. Let's move on to the process. How do you have a successful deed restriction management process? Well, the most important thing to start right up front is to establish whatever the standards are. You say, well, it's in the deed restrictions. Why do we have to establish standards? Well, when you read the deed restrictions, so to speak, give you the topics. We have issues about boats and trailers, about lawn maintenance, about structures, but it doesn't necessarily go into significant detail as to what is acceptable and what is not, something that we can all read and understand. So we need to establish what those standards are beyond what the CC&Rs or deed restrictions say. It's important for the association to recognize and draw a line that not everything is the association's responsibility. It's surprising how often an association or a management company will get a phone call complaining about they're selling drugs out of that house. And our answer is, yeah, I suppose that's a nuisance and annoyance, but you think maybe the police could handle it a little bit better than us sending a letter? And so there are a number of things which are not association responsibility. The board of directors needs to be clear, even though you want to be helpful, don't take on something that is not association responsibility. When a new board is elected, and maybe the old board, the new board thinks the old board was a little lax and the community was going downhill, and the new board comes in with a lot of enthusiasm, it's important to understand that not everything is top priority. We don't need to solve everything at once. We need to make progress. We need to get where the association should be, and then maintaining things at that level is easy. So in establishing our standards, we need to, especially when there may be a change in what those standards are, we need to prioritize things. In a moment, we're going to be talking about shades of gray. Shades of gray is, sure, the restrictions say you must maintain your lawn in a healthful, sanitary, and attractive manner. That language is in most restrictions relative to your landscaping. But let's now determine, okay, how long does the grass have to be before we want to send a letter? Not the number of inches, but what visual appearance of the grass is unacceptable. When a home is faded and needs to be repainted, how faded does it need to be? How much does a gutter have to sag before it's unacceptable? So all those shades of gray are the things we need to understand as an organization, not just the management company, but the board of directors. It's something we refer to as calibrating our eyeballs to make sure we're enforcing the restrictions appropriately for that particular community. We already talked about the benefits of guidelines, and writing those guidelines, whether it's for architectural issues or use restrictions, is really important. It does provide that clear interpretation for an owner who's reading it. They have words that they can understand versus generic, flexible terms that might be in the restrictions themselves. We want to make sure that we're helping owners who want to put in that storage building to know what's required. Can they go ahead and get an aluminum shed? Or must it be wood or a material matching the house? If they want to paint, is the only guidance we give them earth tone colors? Or do we have something that actually gives some guidance relative to on trim or accents we can have these sort of colors, but on the base siding we must have other colors. So guidelines help owners planning their improvements. It provides a consistent basis for the management company, and as management company personnel changes or management companies change, for enforcing the restrictions, for the board of directors in making decisions on appeals of restrictions by homeowners. It allows the Architectural Control Committee to be making consistent decisions over time as to what's acceptable or not. And so it's a great communication tool. In the samples that we provided to you, and there's 59 pages in the document that you received, there are a number of samples of guidelines in there. And the ones we have are really interesting. I'm going to just mention the ones that are in the samples for a moment, and you'll want to look at those at some other time. So for example, we have a chimney stone property maintenance policy. That one deals with what our expectations are, how you maintain your house. The Hearthstone pet and animal policy, the best one I've ever seen that's been put together, that deals with all of the issues that can happen with pets and other animals, and not only deals with it from a standpoint of thou shalt not do this, but it also gives potential remedies for both the owner of that animal or people who are concerned about that animal. Great policy. Then we have some other ones like fence specifications. We have the Vicksburg guidelines, one document that covers everything. Residential use guidelines, nuisance and annoyance guidelines. So I'd suggest you go ahead and look at that. Before we move on to the next slide, slide 2 of the management process, I think we have another question that I'd like to answer. Maybe 2.
Yes, Ralph. I have a question coming in from Penny Bateman. She wants to know, she's out at Flying L Ranch, and they are one of the self-managed communities. So she just wants to kind of clarify what their process is as they're doing to see if they're doing the right thing. She says, we send letters, then a series of fines, then we file liens. Does that work?
There's a bit of a challenge in what was just described. So I'm so glad that we have several folks from self-managed associations who are joining all of our seminars. And the reason is that things are complicated. If you don't have a management company to help, then you either pay an attorney, which can be very expensive, or you do the best you can in what you think is right. And so in what you just described, absolutely, you need to communicate with owners. You need to, and when you look at some of the letter samples that we'll be seeing in a minute, it has the 5 things that you want to be included in every letter. But clearly communicate with the owner, work with the owner if the owner needs additional time or things of that sort. And we'll get through these things in just a minute also. But some of the challenges that are in there, many associations do not have the authority to fine. If it's in your CC&Rs, then you have that ability. If you try to simply create a policy absent the basis in your CC&Rs, that could be problematic. You certainly want any of your policies, which must be filed in the public records, to be reviewed by an attorney prior to filing. So if you do have the ability to fine and you have a reasonable fine policy, great. That can be one of the tools in your tool bag in order to resolve violations. We'll be touching on those in a couple minutes. The area that I found also problematic is filing a lien. There needs to be a basis in your governing documents that would indicate that a fine is a lienable item. I won't go into the legal basis for that. Please consult with your attorney on this. But I would be concerned if liens are being filed on fines, absent an attorney opinion on that. So I think you got a good process from the standpoint of notification, check on the validity of fining people, and check on the ability to put a lien on a fine. And I think we have one more question.
Yes,
a follow-up.
Ralph. I do. I have one more question. Jimmy Burley would like to know, is there an avenue outside of the governing documents of an association that would address a homeowner that has a green pool in their backyard?
Absolutely. If you happen to be in city limits, then there is a health department in that particular city, and that green pool will be in violation of state health laws and city ordinances. City health departments have the resources to do whatever is necessary to abate a public nuisance and a public health hazard like that. In the example that I showed you earlier, the city actually went in, or it wasn't that photo, it was another photo. The city actually went in and boarded up the pool. They drained it, they covered it with plywood structurally covered it with plywood so that a child couldn't wander in there. They can issue citations and fines, drag the person to municipal court, and all of those sort of things. So if you're within a city, there's great resources that can help you. If you're in an unincorporated area, the same state laws apply. The challenge is that some counties don't have significant staffing in their health departments or whatever department is used to deal with these sort of issues. So that may be your challenge. It's not that your county commissioner won't agree this is a terrible problem. It's just a matter of what the resources are. And so for a green pool, no matter city or unincorporated, I would absolutely always start with your municipal resources. Again, the association has some self-help remedies, which we'll be talking about later on, but it won't be as effective as your municipal. So great question there. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Over on this slide, we had talked about the management processes to create what those expectations, standards are for the community. Once you know what it is, you got to communicate these things. Lots of ways to communicate them. If you create guidelines, for example, make sure that they're published on the association's website. You may want to actually mail them to all owners, or as a minimum, e-blast them to the owners that you have email addresses for. If you have a newsletter, put information about the new guidelines in there. If you have particular issues that are coming up, go ahead and write an article, put it out in an e-blast, whatever is necessary to help communicate those things to avoid the problem from coming up, as opposed to only reacting after the fact. If you see a trend, then you may want to be reacting to the whole community after you see a few owners are doing something. The important thing in this communication, though, is it needs to be a positive communication. If it comes across as preaching, if every other word is don't or no and all these negative terms, it's going to turn off the people who are supportive of the association, let alone the people who, have an axe to grind in the first place, the ones who really do need to get this message. So you'll want to explain the process, you'll want to explain the rights of owners and the expectation. Where possible, provide helpful information. So back in the 90s, we were having all sorts of problems with Louisiana Pacific siding and just deteriorating and just falling apart on homes. And so we were putting lots of information in all of our communications about how you can file claims and maybe get some financial restitution, how to identify if you had that sort of siding. Mildew cleaning, that's one of the easiest things to do, but it's surprising how some people don't know that a little bit of Clorox and water and a hose will clean that mildew that's way up on your property. And so providing useful information, how do you get oil stains off a driveway, all of those things is really, really helpful. Obviously, we want to set an example. If we're asking people to edge their lawn, let's make sure the common areas are edged. If we're asking people to mow 42 times a year in the Houston area, darn, our grounds maintenance contract ought to be 42 times a year. I'm not saying we are asking people to mow that frequently, but the association's appearance should be what we expect of owners. Do positive things where possible, and that's where the Yard of the Month programs come in. All of those things are positive aspects, positive examples for neighbors. And then we want that reputation. We want that reputation that says that River Park on the Brazos enforces deed restrictions, that Chabonneau Forest enforces deed restrictions. So if I want to have my trailer in the front yard, I better not move there. It's not bad having a reputation that it's a well-maintained community. On the next page, we've created the expectations, we've communicated and continue to communicate the expectations. Now, if there's a deviation from whatever those standards are, we need to act on them. And so in acting on them, we need to put that in writing. We send a letter to them that has these 5 items in every single letter. We need to describe what the problem is. You have a trailer in your yard. We need to state the expectation. Please remove it from public view. We need to indicate what time frame we expect. Please do it within 14 days. And let them know what the next step is. So when we move to the certified letters, we're letting people know that if it's not resolved, then we'll be referring this to the board of directors to consider further action, including legal action. And then it's extremely important we let them know if you don't understand what we're asking, or you have a concern, or you need more time, give us a call. We want them to have a human being contact, a group, a customer service group that they can contact by whatever many mechanisms you provide. That's got to be in every letter, or else you're being incomplete in your communications. Once we notify them, we put a deadline on there with an expected resolution. It's important that we then follow up. You want to check for changes. Well, maybe they moved it from the left side to the right side of the driveway. So they did something, but it's still visible. We'll want to send appropriate follow-up letters, whatever those follow-up letters might be. And you send those after whatever deadline. Certainly you respect the deadline. You gave them a month. Don't send a letter in 3 weeks because you got a few more complaints about it. You set a deadline, live by the deadline. You expect them to hopefully abide by that deadline. If they've asked for additional time and you've given them an extra couple weeks to take care of it, then wait till after that expiration of the extension before you go any further. Use common sense. So important that we don't, using this example, send mowing letters out or painting letters out in a monsoon. In the middle of winter, when the weather is potentially at nighttime getting below 40, you can't be painting at that time. In the rainy season, you can't be painting. If the house needs painting, it's needed it for a while. So another 2 or 3 months, it's not going to look that much worse. So use common sense. A lot of that in terms of mowing. If the rule of thumb that I personally use is, if I couldn't mow my yard last weekend because it was raining, probably someone else couldn't. And so use common sense. An owner may call and say that they've taken care of the problem. Verify it. Once in a while, people aren't completely honest in their communications with us, and so we'll always want to make sure that if they say that they've moved the trailer, that it really is gone. And then we want a good trail of documentation. We need to always consider that this may be the one that goes to the attorney. If so, we want to have our act together. And then finally, on page 4 of the management process, we can't bluff. A lot of times, especially when we come into an association we're taking over and the board maybe has been frustrated with enforcement in the past, we're asked to send letters on everything. Well, first of all, we help the board prioritize. And then there's the approach, well, yeah, those trash cans are annoying, but send a letter out. You know, some people will take care of them, so we'll get rid of 75% of the trash cans. You know, that also means that 25% of the owners, you have taught that the letters don't matter, and the 75% who did take care of it, you've taught them that we're totally inconsistent. And so you can't bluff. You need to be very consistent in what is done. Remember, everything you do and everything you don't do teaches owners something. The question is, are you teaching them what you want? Are you teaching them that letters matter or they don't matter? Are you teaching them there's no consequences for putting a trailer in the driveway because the trailer next door has been there for 3 months? So everything we do, everything we don't do, teaches folks. So we want to make sure that we're teaching people exactly what the expectations are and being totally uniform and consistent in the way we do it. Now, at some point, there will be a violation that is not resolved. And we have predetermined way up front that this is something that needs to be pursued. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been pursuing it. So if all else fails, we need to get the attorney involved. Getting the attorney involved is kind of a last chance way of doing things. It's not what we prefer to do. When you get the attorney involved, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be time consuming, and it's going to create bad feelings. There's no doubt about it. But it needs to be done. That is the responsibility of the board to protect property values and everything that goes with it. So I'm going to do a real quick shades of gray here. I like this one, especially when we're live, where we've got interaction within the room, because I've shown right here shades of gray relative to running a business. And what this is meant to say is, here are 5 different businesses being operated out of a home. Or let me rephrase it, 5 different activities being done at a home in a community. And so we can go through each one and we can say, okay, here's a mechanic who's repairing a car. Tires are off, he's got the car lifted, maybe not on a commercial lift like that, but it's up on jacks or something. Is that a violation of running a business? Well, all of you who are astute would say, but wait, Ralph, what do the deed restrictions say? You're absolutely correct. We go to the documents. And let's say the deed restrictions have general language saying no business, industrial use of properties, whether or not for profit or not. So it has that language. You say, well, of course, repairing cars is a violation. Well, in this case, I would say, nope. This guy happens to be a mechanic. That's his car. He has a really cool lift in his garage. The door's closed. He fixes his car only. Is that a business? Of course not. Seamstress. So she's hemming up someone's seams. Is it a business? Maybe. Because she also has 8 other people who come to the property each day. She has shipments coming in. They're actually making full outfits that then they're selling on the internet. Yeah, that's kind of a business. And you can go through each one of these. Home-based corporate sales. Would that ever be a business? He's just on the phone. Well, let's say this particular owner, this person, is a pharmaceutical salesperson. Okay, so what? He's selling drugs over the phone. Yeah, except that he sells to pharmacies and hospitals, and all of his supplies are kept in his garage. So we've got highly addictive narcotic samples in his garage. Is that problematic? Yeah, probably from a safety standpoint. So shades of gray is simply illustrating that on anything, whether it's mowing, painting, how long can a trailer be in a driveway before we proceed, those are the shades of gray that we need to deal with in order to consistently and uniformly carry out the objectives of enforcement which are protection of property values and desirability of the neighborhood. Before I get into statistics, I think we have another good question.
Surprisingly enough, Ralph, it's coming from Texas again.
Texas.
So Ravi would like to know, if the violation is a repeat offender, can the fines be doubled or increased even if not stipulated in the enforcement policy or the fining policy?
Thank you, Ravi. So the question is, if we have a flagrant and chronic offender, and we have the ability to fine, which River Park on the Brazos does, can we accelerate, double, or do something similar to the fines? And Ravi, you actually answered the question right at the end where you said where it is not in the policy. And the answer is, if it's not in the policy, no, you can't do it. Could you put that in the policy? Absolutely. You could have a policy that is, there's many types of fine systems. It could be on a per occurrence. It could be on a per period of time. Or it could be that on the first occurrence it's $5, on the next occurrence it's $10, on the next it's $20, and have an accelerated fine based on the frequency or the recurrence of it. So good question. The key is it's all in whatever the policy is. Well, let's move on to this next slide. Before we get into, and in about 5 minutes, we'll get into all those tough problems. So let's look at some statistics. What are the most common violations? And this is just an eye-opening set of slides that you'll be seeing here. So what we did is over a 10-year period, and this was from 2000 to 2009, we took every violation that we opened at C.I.A. services in any of our communities. And so this covers all types of communities, and we broke them into 15 categories. We have more categories, but we group things together. Absolutely, the highest number of violations was for lawn care type things. And lawn care includes mowing and weeding and trimming shrubbery and tree maintenance and anything related to that. So over this period of time, there were 640,000 violations that we pursued. The next one is simply a graphical version of that. And this shows it even better, how you can see how much the top 3 categories dominate. The top 3 are landscaping, which we just described, trash. Trash is trash cans in view, trash cans kept at the curb except on the pickup day, things that are just thrown on the side of the property that are trash that are never even put out. You can see that is a large one. Annoyance and nuisance is pretty high on the list simply because that's a catch-all. So there's a lot of things in there. But those are the main categories, all the way down to holiday decorations, signs, and things like that. They're barely visible on this graph, but they're truly out there. That doesn't tell you a whole lot, except there's a lot of violations. What's more important for these purposes is let's dig down deeper. Let's figure out what are the tough violations. Statistically, what are the tough violations, not just what we think they are. And so what we've done here is this. We've taken the 2% of all violations that go past second letter. I'm going to show you that 2% in just a minute. But of the 2% that go past the second letter, those are the tough ones. Those are the ones that the owners aren't being as cooperative. Those are the ones that may end up going to legal. But of those, now let's do something, a little technique called normalization. The whole purpose of normalization is to determine which ones take more effort to resolve. And my helpers here are making a joke. So, which ones take more effort to resolve? When we do it this way, the order makes sense. So this is the percent of each type of violation that needs to go to further action. So we'll see here, forget the builder category right now. That's a specialized category. Let's look at the next ones. The ones that take the most effort are painting, home repairs, fences, and ACC. ACC being things where maybe someone has made an improvement that wasn't acceptable or things like that. Whereas if we go to all the way to the other end, we see the things that take much less effort are things like trash, holiday lights, landscaping, signs. Why are we even going that far on things like a sign in the yard, like a painter sign in the yard? Well, we wouldn't normally, but normally some of these things are maybe associated with some of the tougher ones. If someone's not mowing their yard and they're also not painting their house, well, if we have to take an extra step, we'll sometimes say, since we're sending you this really accelerated letter on, or stronger letter on painting your house, by the way, you also need to mow your yard. Why does it make sense? Well, if you look at this, this exactly correlates with cost. The things that are tougher are the things that cost more. Painting your house is expensive. Making home repairs is expensive. Replacing fences or repairing fences are expensive. Getting rid of a trash can? Free. Taking down holiday lighting? An hour of effort. Taking a sign out of your yard, mowing your yard. And so the tough ones are the ones that are more expensive for a homeowner to resolve. That's why they're tough. It all comes down to money. So, how effective is the process? We've just gone through the management process. We've talked about expectations, communication of expectations, communication of deviations, and taking other steps as necessary. So is the process effective? It's extremely effective. This table here at the bottom, and let me point to some things right here. This is what we refer to internally as our violation resolution experience. And possibly once a year you'll see this in your board packages. Our managers will generally run your resolution experience for the last year and put it in your January, February board package. And what this says right here, we looked at a 10-year period from 2007 until 2016. So it's basically the last 10 years. And this is saying that this is a number of violations that closed at, for example, first letter status. So in this 10-year period, we had 737,000 violations that we were working with. That's a lot. And of those, 283,000 closed at first letter status. 367 closed at noted status, etc. All the way, totally adding up to the 737,000. Let's look at that as a percentage basis. This says that basically 50% closed at noted status, 38 at first letter, 9% here. The cumulative column is where it really gets interesting. So that column says that 50% of all violations we opened, we never had to send a letter. 50%. This has been our experience over the life of C.I.A. services on every single community is in the range of 45 to 55%. It's consistent. Why is that number important? That number is important for a number of reasons. One is, it explains to you exactly why our process is we observe once and don't send a letter, in most cases. If we go back for the second observation and it's still there, we send a letter. If we had sent a letter on the first observation, we would have upset an extra 367,000 people. That they were going to take care of it already. They were going to take care of it. And then we go to second letter or the first letter. 88% of all violations are resolved with no more than one letter, no more than a first letter. 98% of all violations are resolved at no more than a second letter. That's where that 2% of tough violations came from in the last slides. How many go to the attorney? Over this 10-year period, 2,000 in all of our communities. That's 0.3% go to the attorney. How many actually resulted in a lawsuit? 0.02% over this 10-year period of all of our communities, starting with 740,000 violations, only 169 violations ended up as lawsuits. And that's not 169 lawsuits, because many of those lawsuits include multiple violations. So over this 10-year period with all of this, again, we see that the process is effective. It really does work when there's intelligence in the process, when there's common sense in the process, and we do good communications. One of the things I love about this violation resolution experience table is this. All the board members who are listening tonight, and everyone who views this, you spend a lot of time dealing with deed restriction violations. It's on every one of your agendas. You're looking at requests for last chance letters. You maybe are approving things to go to the attorney or a lawsuit. Your neighbors, when there is a violation, they come to you and they say, we've got this violation. And your whole perspective is that it's all terrible. No one's listening. No one's cooperative. This table tells you otherwise. It tells you 88% of the owners in your community, with one letter, they're taking care of things. That 98% of all owners in your community are taking care of things with maybe that a little stronger second letter. And so it's really nice to put this in perspective. You as board members are always dealing with those exceptions. You're making decisions on those exceptions. But the reality is, across all these communities, in your community, things are running well, and they are effective. The next couple pages, we're just going to go through those. You have samples in the documents that were sent to you ahead of time that include sample of all of our standard letters. We have many custom letters that our staff generates, but these are the standard letters. And on these files, on this sample, you can see that we tell people when we last saw something. We give them a specific deadline. We tell them what the problem is and the expected resolution. We tell them what's next. If it's a certified letter, at the very bottom of the letter, we have language that's required under the Texas Property Code, notifying an owner of their right to a hearing in front of the board. So not only do they have these letters, but they have a right to come to their elected board members and discuss the issue and understand and possibly resolve the issue. It also has some additional language required by the Texas Property Code relative to persons who are in active military duty. We have a bunch of reports you see every month, so no reason to go over these particular reports. This report right here, which is what we refer to as our violation summary by address, has a very clear purpose. It shows you the violations by address. But it has a hidden purpose that your manager may have mentioned to you. And the purpose is this. This report, I guarantee you, admit it, because you do this. This report, when you get your board package every month, you turn to this report and you see if you're on the list. Admit it, you do. That is exactly what we want you to do, and that's why we put it in this order in your board package as opposed to some other order. We want you to look at this report and see if you're on the list. If you're on the list, which doesn't often happen, but if you're on the list, you will tell us maybe you'll tell us thank you. Maybe you'll say, yeah, I do need to get to that. Can I have an extension? Your spouse might say, I've been telling him or her to take care of this. So we've actually had thanks from spouses on some of these things. But you'll also be looking at your neighbors who are on the list. You'll look at those, you'll go out to look at their property, and you'll come to the meeting and say, Ralph, I think you're being a little too strict. Or you'll come to the meeting and say, my neighbor's house looks terrible. Why isn't it on the list? That's what we refer to as calibrating our eyeballs. Without you having to ride around the community every single time and look at this long list every time, we're getting feedback continuously from board members that are saying where the line should be drawn. That's invaluable to us. And so that's why we really love this particular report. Violation status report, you see that often. It's now time to get into the tough problems, and we have 8 of them here. I'm going to go through each of these problems and how do we deal with them. So the problems are chronic lawn care. How about off-site owners and tenants? Pet problems. Multiple families in a home. How about group homes? Commercial vehicles, amending deed restrictions, or not enforcing restrictions in the past. These are all challenging problems. So let's go through them. Start with chronic lawn care. The bottom right-hand side, you'll see a nice little graphic that is our degree of difficulty. And so you'll either see easy, medium, or hard. And that is simply an indication on each one about how difficult this particular one is. This really isn't that bad. Degree of difficulty is medium. How do you deal with lawn care, specifically chronic lawn care, the people who are not taking care of their lawn on a routine basis? Certainly we send letters to anyone who has a lawn care issue. We're very specific. Maybe someone's mowing but they're not edging. So we don't just generically say your lawn is not up to par. We say specifically what the problem is. If we have a recurring problem, the reason this is a relatively easy item is your deed restrictions, unless you have some really unusual ones, almost every set of deed restrictions has what we refer to as self-help provisions or forced maintenance provisions, where it says if someone is not living up to the restrictions, you can actually send a contractor onto the property to take care of it. Self-help almost always includes lawn care. In some cases, that may include many other things, up to any violation can be cured by self-help. I mean, literally, you could go in and paint a house. We would never recommend that approach. But lawn care, which we're talking about now, is the perfect place to use self-help. So we send a special letter, a forced maintenance letter, a sample is in the handouts that you received, that says, do this. If it's not done by this date, we will send a contractor out to take care of it. You'll be charged the full cost of that mowing plus an administrative fee. When we send a contractor out, if we need to, the contractor will get a before photo and an after photo, so we have a photo right there when the contractor arrived, so the homeowner can't say, well, I mowed it the day before your contractor got here. We have the before photo, we have the after photo. The contractor will take care of the property, the contractor will send us an invoice, we will then invoice the homeowner plus an administrative fee. Sending a contractor out is a special trip. It is expensive. And so if that homeowner hired someone to do it, it may cost them $35 a week to have their yard mowed. They will be shocked when they get a bill for $160, $180 for mowing their yard. They'll be outraged, they'll be angry, they'll call us up and say all sorts of things. However, you can be sure that is the last time we will be mowing that property. The owner will get their teenage son to earn his allowance, if they have one. Or they'll hire someone who charges $35 instead of what they just got charged from the association. In some cases, and the contractor will always knock on the door first and say, I'm here to do this. If the homeowner turns them away, if they're home and they say, go away, the contractor will always leave. Nobody's going to create a confrontation. But what generally happens at that point is the owner says, oh wow, I guess they were serious. And then we stop seeing the chronic lack of maintenance. If it's a vacant house, for example, or if there's a situation where we don't want to force mow, well, maybe the city or the county can enforce a health type violation, especially in the backyard. Neighbors may be mowing the front yard, but they're not going into the backyard. And then potentially you could use JP Court. We cover that in some of the other seminars. It's quick and inexpensive, but it's not a real good solution for hardly any enforcement issues. So let's move on to off-site owners and tenants. You look down at the bottom right and you see degree of difficulty is easy. You say, Ralph, what are you, crazy? But the reality is that this ends up being something that is generally easier to deal with. How do we deal with it on a global scale? Well, first of all, you don't want tenants to feel like they're ostracized. The tenants aren't welcome in the community. So make sure that tenants are always that they feel a part of the community, that they are getting newsletters if you have them, that they're included in e-blasts if you can get a hold of their addresses. When we do need to point out a deviation, then we want to make sure that the letter is going to the appropriate party. So if it's mowing, absolutely, that first letter goes to the tenant. Doesn't need to go to the owner at that point. If it's something like repainting the house, no use sending it to the tenant. That's going to be something the owner is responsible for. Everything in between goes to both. So if a tenant has a boat in the driveway, we're going to send it to both the owner and the tenant. Because if the tenant doesn't take care of it, we want to be able to go to the next step immediately and not have to wait to do the first notification to the owner. And so we send the letter to the appropriate one. Why is a tenant sometimes easier to deal with than an owner relative to violations? Because the owner of that property, this is a profit center for that owner. This is an investment for that owner. They're making money off that property by the rents paid by the tenant. Anything that we do that cuts into their profits hits them in the pocketbook. We saw earlier when we were looking at the effectiveness that money is what drives the tough problems. So if they're not mowing and we force mow the property and that owner is paying $180 for that mowing, you can be sure that property owner is going to be on that tenant and be our ally in resolving it. If we have a fine system, the fine goes to the owner, even if the tenant is the one who's creating the reason for the fine. That is going to convince the owner to stay on the tenant. And then finally, if there's such a thing as a bad tenant, I hate using that word, but if we have a bad tenant, the bad tenant may move out voluntarily because they don't like getting the letters, they don't like getting what's happening. Or the owner may evict them or not renew the lease because they are costing them money. So a bad tenant can eventually leave. An owner is there as long as they want to be. So working with tenants and offsite owners really is not that difficult. Well, let's move on to pet problems. Pet problems, this is something that, again, I would refer you to look at what is in the samples and look at that Hearthstone pet and animal policy. It's a really unique approach that looks at all sides of a problem and gives everybody, all the stakeholders in this, a solution or a possible approach to any type of problem. So, pet problems include everything from barking, pets running loose, whether they're cats or dogs running loose, defecating. That's what a lot of times produces it, where a cat is running loose and likes to dig up the front rose bed that the owners are so proud of and put little surprises in there. Or a dog doing the same thing in the front yard, or most annoying, when a dog is on a leash and the owner is not carrying a bag with them to pick up whatever is put on someone's property. It also includes vicious animals. So from our standpoint, in most cases, we're sending what we refer to as a courtesy letter. A courtesy letter is one that we won't necessarily follow up on, because animal problems in a lot of cases are something that we're getting secondhand information. Someone's telling us they're barking 24 hours a day. They're telling us that they're, doing their stuff on my lawn, that they're running loose. And by the way, they're running loose and we don't know who they belong to. And so in many cases, we're sending a courtesy letter that points out the problem to the owner, if we know who the owner is, and suggests solutions. But we're not going to proceed on that unless we have some documentation, including a person who is willing to testify if we ever have to go to court. And that's normally something someone is not willing to do. And then there are outside agencies that can assist us in these things, assist the association or the owner who's concerned. So if it's a vicious animal, someone running loose, that's an animal control issue. An association has no right to capture dogs, take dogs off a property. We can write letters and we can sue. So keep that in mind. We can write letters, we can sue. Potentially we can fine. Pet problems, it's a much more of a challenge to have a fine policy that includes pet issues. If it's a sanitation issue, so there are dogs in the backyard or in a pen in the backyard and the owner never cleans up, that would be an odor and a sanitation issue that a health department could deal with more effectively than an association. If it's a noise issue, a barking dog late at night, dogs bark. If they're barking periodically during the day, it's not necessarily a problem. But if they're barking late at night, that absolutely is a problem. Law enforcement can deal with that. If someone, believe me, if someone carrying a gun and a badge wakes you up at 3 in the morning and tells you to keep your dogs quiet, you're likely to take care of that situation. You're likely to bring them in the house. And then finally, if there's a cruelty issue, if there's someone has, 100 cats in their house or any of those type of things, both the municipal authorities or the SPCA or other animal advocacy groups might all be opportunities for you to work with them and let them take the problem. So pet problems, I'm showing these as medium because they absolutely can be annoying or dangerous, and the association has very little ability to deal with it without working through outside organizations. Let's move on to the next one. Multiple families in homes. This is one that really isn't an enforceable violation. And many times we'll have either homeowners or board members even who will indicate that there are multiple families living in that home and our deed restrictions prohibit it. It'll always point to the clause which uses the word single-family homes. The reality is, if it says this community is meant for single-family homes, for example, that is solely describing the type of structure, the type of home, that there are single-family homes versus multifamily homes, like apartments or in some cases duplexes or fourplexes or things like that. It's not describing that only one family can live in a home. It's simply describing the type of structures. And so in most cases, there's no language in the restrictions which actually try to limit the people who are physically in the house. And even if it did, it would really be a challenge to indicate what is a family. You would almost have to insert moral issues into that equation. So is cohabitation multifamily? If you have a man and a woman who are not married, who are living together, or cohabitating, is that multiple families? If you have a man and a man, a woman and a woman, same situation, is that a multifamily? All of those things are really moral issues. The question is, are they affecting the neighborhood? So the way to deal with what may be described as multiple family is to deal with whatever problems are resulting from that. If we don't like the fact that we have a family with multiple generations there that's quiet and causes no problems, that is not a violation. There is nothing wrong with having multiple generations or, two same-sex people in there or roommates or whatever it might be. But if there are problems resulting from that, we need to deal with what those problems are. What problems sometimes come from multiple families? The biggest one is vehicle parking. If you have many families in a house or multiple generations, many times there are a lot of cars. That also happens with a family who has 5 children who are all 17 through 22 living at home. That's a lot of births in a 5-year period, and they all have cars. So the parents have cars, the kids have cars. That problem is a parking problem. It has nothing at all to do whether or not you have a single family in the home or others. If you have, maybe you're in a community that's close to a college. We have some of that at UTSA in San Antonio area, where a house is rented out and you have a lot of students who live there. Sometimes students have wild parties. And so if it's a wild party issue, if it's a noise issue, deal with that. And in some limited cases, I know Sugar Land has some ordinances that deal with the number of people who can live in a house. It doesn't have to do with whether or not they're related, but the number of people. Then maybe the city can help if you feel there are too many people living in a house. Okay, the next one is group homes. What in the world is a group home? A group home is a protected type of business. A group home would include things like elder care facilities, halfway houses, care for those with disabilities, that are absolutely a business. They're a for-profit business where a business buys a home specifically in a residential community, and they have caretakers at the home, and they have people who need care living at the home. It's absolutely a business, for-profit business. Both of those group homes are protected by both federal and state laws. And in Texas, the state law protecting it's in the Human Resources Code, is the Community Homes for Disabled Persons Location Act. Now, the theory behind this is that it is better for those people, whether it be elderly people or any of the other protected classes, to be more in a more normal environment, not in an institution, so to speak, but in a real community that has stores nearby, that has people nearby, that has children nearby, that has a full human setting. And so that's the theory behind the law, and that's why it's protected. The lower part of the screen describes what a person with disability is, and it's very, very broad. The protections under both federal and state law do have limitations, though. So if the existence of a group home creates problems for the community, then in most cases you're going to want to get the attorney involved right up front. This will be a corporate expense. Don't be billing it back to the property, but you need advice from an expert in this area. And with the information you have, you can then, with the attorney's help, determine if they are potentially in violation of their protections. If they are, then you can complain to the manager who's on site, the owner, or the regulatory agency. This one is rated as a degree of difficulty of hard because there are strong protections in place and you will get a lot of pushback trying to even get reasonable things resolved. In one particular case, we have one of these in the middle of a community. It's fully protected. The problems all deal with parking issues relating to the staff in this particular community. It's at the end of a cul-de-sac, so the staff that needs to be there, it has been parking on the street after we got them to not park on the grass. With cars and visitors coming in and out, you have a lot of traffic there, and if there's a car behind one that's in the driveway, the other one pulls out over the grass and ruts the grass. And so they're very, very difficult problems. But there are some approaches that you can take, but this is one that's a difficult solution. Commercial vehicles. This used to be a much larger problem. It's not so much anymore. Degree of difficulty is medium. If you have something that covers vehicle size, so you don't want those tractor trailers in the driveway, then you can proceed under your CC&Rs if you like. If you've got big vehicles coming in, there may be weight limit issues. DPS can help with that. Chances are it won't be a high priority. If a driver is actually bringing their load into the community and it has the signs on the back, so you bring in chemicals into the community versus non-chemicals, then TxDOT would be involved in any hazardous loads and things like that. If you're within a city and there's an ordinance, then the police can come in and potentially ticket and tow. You can complain to the operator. There's going to be a sign on the side of the truck. Complain to them about this truck is in the community. If it's an owner-operator, well, the trucker is going to say whatever truckers would say to you when you ask them to remove the vehicle. It's not repeatable. So you have all of those potential steps you can take. If it ends up being a significant problem in the community, there's actually something in the Texas Transportation Code that allows a community to get a petition of the residents, present it to the county commissioner. If that all occurs, then signs can be placed in the community about commercial vehicles not coming in. And if those signs are in there, then any law enforcement official can enforce that within the community, including fining or citations or towing. So It's difficult from the standpoint of they come and go. And if you want the hard-clad solution, it does take a petition effort. But it's certainly doable. Let's move on to the last couple here. So, amending documents. We often hear board members saying we need to amend our bylaws, our CC&Rs, whatever it is. Amending CC&Rs, these are the use restrictions that we're dealing with here, the deed restriction management, requires a high consent. Under state law, it is no higher than 67%, but 67% of all owners is a big hurdle. So amending is an approach, but it is very difficult to amend CC&Rs. So the question is, they're not perfect. None are perfect. Even the best ones, you can look at those and you can come up with something that should be different. But can they get the job done? That's the question. Remember, we have our ability to clarify them. We can take advantage of guidelines to clarify. If it's really a bylaws issue, then amending bylaws is actually easy. But if it's on use restrictions, guidelines are a powerful tool. Guidelines can't create new restrictions. So if there's nothing in there about parking, you can't create a guideline that says no parking, no street parking. But if there is something about parking, you can create a guideline that says we really mean no overnight parking, or whatever you might want to do. So take advantage of guidelines. It's a very, very powerful tool. If you do decide you want to amend the restrictions, then it's a marketing effort. You need to figure out what you want. You need to gain consensus from as many people as you can in the community. Get their input before you start trying to get signatures. The attorney's going to prepare the legal documents, but the board of the management company is going to want to prepare what I'll refer to as your marketing documents. Even though you'll let everyone have the full document, you'll want to describe the full document in more user-friendly terms. That's what I'm referring to as the marketing documents. And don't go into this thinking it's going to be easy. Don't underestimate the effort it's going to take, the apathy. Not that people don't care, but are people going to take the time to read this and return it? That's going to be your biggest problem. And then the opposition. You might have a few people who are opposed to get the mailing list for the whole community and decide they want to communicate to all owners how bad this is. Do they need to be truthful? Not necessarily. So success will depend on how you market this. This is one of those difficult ones. The last one we're going to cover is lack of enforcement. So this occurs when maybe you have a self-managed community which is now deciding we have a new board, we want to do things better, we want to maybe bring things up, or if you're a change in management company, you're all excited about being with C.I.A. services, so you want to clean up everything that wasn't done in the last 20 years. So lack of enforcement. You got to start sometime. So you need to start. Don't simply delay and say, yeah, we've never really dealt with this, so maybe later. At some point you need to start. The only way to successfully deal with the issue is to start. Your largest challenge is absolutely going to be what you have taught, what the association has taught all the owners and residents in the past. You've taught them what was acceptable. They've had daily visual reminders of what was acceptable that really isn't. And so changing those learned attitudes is going to be a big challenge. So communication is key. And then you need to accept. You need to go in accepting that there are some things that may not be resolvable, period. You hate it, but you can't do anything about it. So, things that are unresolvable are structures. If you have unacceptable structures, someone built a 2-story storage shed, it's been there 10 years, and it was built out of concrete and steel. It's not going to fall down. You just got to accept. There's nothing to do about that. Don't have any heartache over it. Move on. There are things that will get resolved over time. So that house that's purple like this, or orange like that, or orange like my shirt, at some point they need to be repainted. You'll need to live with it until it needs to be repainted. Upon repainting, then all of a sudden it becomes beige, or whatever color it needs to be. A fence which looks wrong, eventually it'll need to be replaced. At that point, that's taken care of. And then you have all the ones that are easy to resolve sooner. Lawn care. It grew up today. Tomorrow you can send a letter and not allow lawn care, trash, and various maintenance issues to perpetuate. You can take care of those. You need to prioritize, make steady progress, and celebrate that progress. Don't allow newer problems to occur. The last slide here is waiver. You'll hear this all the time, that you've waived your right to enforce that restriction because my neighbor has a purple house, so darn, I'm going to have a purple house. You have no right to tell me. Well, the whole thing about waiver and grandfathering and abandonment, all those terms you'll hear non-attorneys many times throwing out, they don't just happen. Those are affirmative defenses when you go to court. And judges are the ones who determine whether or not something's been waived. And so specifically, there are 3 cases here. I didn't do this research, attorneys did, so I want to give them credit. But there have been 3 cases in Texas law where someone has gone, or a case has gone to an appeals court, which means it can be cited as a precedent. Let's not worry about exactly what these cases were about. The citations are here if you want them. But in one particular case, 9% of all homes in the community had this exact same thing that the association was trying to enforce on the next owner. In that case, the judge said, that's not waiver. Next person, you can't do this. Another case, 16%, almost 17% of the homes in the whole community had this exact same thing. The judge says, that's not a waiver. You can stop this next person from doing it. Then in the third case was 27% of the owners in the community had this problem. The judge said, association, you really haven't been doing your job. You've really waived your right to tell this next person he can't do it. So with this little graph here, you see that it's somewhere maybe above 17%, but lower than 27% is where waiver, according to the courts in Texas, occurs. So if one person is telling you, I can have a purple house because my neighbor does, that's not a legally supportable argument. Let me go ahead and close with this slide right here, which I love. When I lived in Houston, one of my favorite columnists, and I used to read his column in the Sunday Zest magazine every week because he's so fun, good guy, Ken Hoffman. And he wrote this in the Houston Chronicle way back in 2008. He said, I like homeowners associations. I'm constantly amazed when someone moves into a neighborhood, signs an agreement to abide by the rules of the neighborhood, but when he breaks the rules, he blames the homeowners association for being unfair, unpatriotic, or heathen. Homeowners associations protect the rights and wishes of 99% of the residents. If you want to turn your yard into Fred Sanford's junkyard, or your living room into Van Halen's recording studio, you need to move somewhere else. So, that clip sort of dated me back to the, I guess, early 80s, late 70s, whatever it was. But that's basically our practical deed restriction management seminar. And I hope you've really enjoyed what's here. This webcast and all the others are part of our seminar series, and they're on YouTube. So you'll be able to get your fellow board members to look at this seminar and any of the other seminars. This will be the 4th one that we have out there, and we'll be putting more out there each month. So thank you so much for coming. We'll continue to answer some of your chats directly. But again, thanks for coming and hope to see you next time. Our next one is actually in July. That's Essentials of Architectural Control. Great seminar. Hope to see you then. Thanks.